second installment of our Smart Cinema Series 2018. It's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Graham Harris. Graham has worked in and around the interface between research management and policy for more than 40 years. Oh, can't be that. You can't be that. He specializes in trying to understand and manage the complex interactions between the environment and society, with a particular focus on water and natural resource management. Graham taught at the McMaster University in Canada for 15 years, where he worked in the ecology and management of the Great Lakes. Then he moved to Australia in '84 and worked for CSIRO for over 20 years. Gosh, that's a challenge.
They freak me out.
Where he held many senior research management and executive appointments. Until June 2011, Graham was the founding director of the expanded Lancaster Environment Centre at Lancaster University in UK, one of the largest environmental research centres in Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, that's where he worked closely with our current Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Weddings. I would add that many of you know that Graham has been kind enough to accept the position of Senior Honorary Fellow with the Smart Infrastructure Facility, and I'm personally very grateful for it because he's brought his very inquisitive mind into SMART, and he's always the man who's asking the right questions for which I don't have an answer. So thank you, Graham, for taking the time to come to us today and present something that's going to be very, very interesting, I know. And the title of your presentation is Dealing with Uncertainty with the Observer in the Loop. Graham, the floor is yours now.
As the performers in the old variety theatres used to say, wait till I do something and then applaud afterwards. I've given a couple of these talks before, and this is an extension, if you like, to what I've done before. I'm going to take you into disciplines that you won't be familiar with. And I remind you that standing before you is a scientist with some reputation of I don't know how many years. And you'll see that I've actually now become a social scientist and even a political scientist, because I started off on this journey to try and understand the environment in which I was doing my science, and also try to understand the sort of public understanding of science and the relationship between the discipline and the community, essentially. And as Pascal said, it's been something I've been interested in for a long time. Now, a quick summary. I've used the background to this slide 2 or 3 times in this room before. Think of a sort of an axis, and on this side we have considerable uncertainty. There's a lot of things that we don't know. If you remember Donald Rumsfeld with his famous quote about unknown unknowns, lots of complexity. If you were to do anything, you might use the precautionary principle. I don't really know what I'm doing, so I better be careful and not do anything wrong. On this end, we have lots of known knowns. We have universal laws. We have what's called scientific management. This really is the kind of Western Anglo way of operating these days. We use a lot of statistics. We look for evidence. We can build bridges and they don't fall down. We assume that the risks are simple and understood. And then what I'm going to do is essentially move to the right across that plot, that graph, throughout this talk. Now, what I must remind you is that when you do science, you make a whole series of assumptions. And in fact, I've said this before and I'll say it again. Those of you here who are not from an Anglo-Western background, you must understand the philosophical basis of the science that you do. All of you must do that, because you have a whole bunch of isms that sit behind what you do. Science assumes what's called dualism. In other words, science assumes that you have a rational facility, this magical thing that makes us human called reason, and that's separate from everything else. Reason is a kind of magical universal acid, as it's been called. You assume realism. If you build a computer model, you assume that the things in your model are real and exist as such. You use a lot of reason. Science always says it's value-free, etc., etc. What do we mean by ergodicity? Science assumes that the initial conditions of whatever system you've been studying quickly get forgotten, so that we have an equilibrium, we have universal laws, the world is predictable, it has regular statistical property, and evidence informs our actions. In other words, we have evidence-based policy. Now this is essentially physics, but this physics envy affects just about everything else that we do, from cognitive science to social science, economics and so on. In fact, there was a big article on Eon, the website of sort of upmarket essays the other day about the problems with economics and physics envy. And this is, if you like, the senior science, and I kid you not, when I first went to teach in Canada, all the chemists and physicists were in a building that was labelled senior sciences, and all the biologists were over the road in another building altogether. So there is a real degree of intellectual snobbery that goes with this. If you're doing real science, and in fact Rutherford, Lord Rutherford, the really famous particle physicist, said there is physics and everything else is stamp collecting. So we're kind of in the land of, if we're not doing physics, we're not doing anything real and we're not doing it properly. And science is about explanation. It seeks explanations for things that go on in the world. I'll come back to that point. Now, scientific management assumes that the world is kind of at an optimum. And the whole point about scientific management is that we use an enormous amount of monitoring, we use an enormous amount of data, and the idea is to keep the ball balanced on top of the hump. If it wobbles a bit off the hump, we need to know. So we have monitoring, we have evidence, we do a lot of data collection, and then we have in place management procedures, corrective, predictive tools, which would help us to push it back up onto the top of the hump again. So the world is assumed that not only is the world in some kind of an optimum, but we want to keep it there. So we need some pretty simple risks that we understand. We need to be able to quantify them. We need risk statistics so that we understand how far off the optimum we are and how to get it to go back again. It's a bit like the Falcon Heavy that took off, the new rocket that they launched the other day. You want to be able to keep it on course. You need to know if it's deviated off course, how to correct it and so on. So it's a bit like keeping a rocket on course. Why the hell they put a car on the front of it is another thing. And I mean, talk about vanity. Talk about vanity projects. We've now got a bloody Tesla sports car in orbit and a glitter ball, believe it or not.
Oh, well, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay. And of course, the other thing that we have is insurance, because if you understand the risks, if you understand how much it's going to wobble and how to keep it on there, then you can insure against things that go wrong because you know the probability of things going wrong. So science and the whole worldview is about keeping the ball on top of the hump. Now, when we build infrastructure, what we are trying to do is to reduce risk. What we're trying to do, and this is, believe it or not, Los Angeles, this is what they do to rivers in Los Angeles because they find floods embarrassing. So what you do is you put the river in a channel and you surround it by an enormous series of floodworks to make sure that nobody's basement gets filled up the next time you have a rainstorm. So infrastructure is about trying to flatline uncertainty. Science is about trying to make the world predictable. Science traditionally underestimates uncertainty. We have a worldview which kind of limits our range of thinking about what could possibly go wrong. The obvious upshot of a lot of this, of course, is that we tend to be blindsided by the unexpected. And in fact, there's the famous book by Nassim Taleb called Fooled by Randomness, because we always assume that our variability is Gaussian, statistically randomly distributed, that there is a mean and standard deviation which we understand. Now, if things go outside of that, we get into trouble. Now, there is a systems view. This what we call modernist view, and this takes me to politics and sociology. That modernist view dominates our systems thinking, particularly about infrastructure and natural environmental management. We think of the world as being efficient. We try and make it efficient. We try and make it cost effective. We try and have things like sustainable development, which is a euphemism for let's manage the world so that everything is understandable and predictable. And particularly since the 1980s, we've had this view about infrastructure as reducing variability, making the world understandable. We tend to see systems as isolated, mathematical, predictive, more certain than they really are. We abstract from the real world systems that we think we understand. And in terms of environmental management, which is the other thing, we brought in economics into this modernist view, so that the world is in terms now of things like ecosystem services that you can put a price on. It's all of a piece. The phenomenon, the modern worldview is all of a piece. Now, this is where things get political, and I'm not going to be political because both sides of government, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, are infected by the same disease. So if I'm being anti-political, I'm applying it to all politicians. Since Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 70s, we have tended to see a whole series of ideas get rolled out right through the world of science, right through the world of infrastructure, environmental management. There's even a new book about architecture which shows exactly the same thing in architecture as well. And it's all to do with privatization of public assets, public and private partnerships, smaller governments, jobs and growth, as we keep hearing this government banging on about. Innovation means the government, universities and innovation nexus. The universities have all taken the Faustian bargain. They take the money we provide, assistance to jobs and growth, and the financialization of everything, so that every time you make a transaction with your credit card, somebody gets a few percent as it goes past. Now, this is an entire worldview that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years. That goes with models, with predictability, with physics envy, with the whole modernist worldview. It's all of a piece. And that's the world we live in, predominantly in the West. Now, even as I said, architecture is now being influenced by this, that we get these enormous vanity projects now run up. I mean, you get city tunnels, you get things that politicians want to open. This is a building by Zaha Hadid. All her buildings have these wonderful flowing lines. But often what happens, and this happened in Baku in Azerbaijan, they just pulled down a whole chunk of the city in order to build somebody's vanity project. So all sorts of interesting issues about finance, the way we look at money, the way we put the world together, and the way we think the world is predictable. So, fitting in with that, we are beginning to see some problems. And this is, I guess, where I started on this journey a long time ago, because many of our major complex projects are starting to either not deliver or have enormous cost overruns or run into serious problems. I started off with this thing called the Water Framework Directive in the European Union, where the managers of the European Union declared that all the rivers in the European Union would be returned to good ecological condition by 2015. The last time I looked, they had run up a bill of 63 billion euros and they had nothing to show for it. So I started thinking, what's going on here, guys? Why aren't we getting the outcomes? Ricardo's got some lovely horror stories that he can tell you about defense software projects that we've spent billions of taxpayers' project money on and they didn't deliver. What happened? They sold the helicopters to New Zealand, right? We've got the cross-city tunnel that they built and then they had to close roads in order to make people use it. So there are all sorts of delays, cost overruns, problems with engineering. Ben Flyberg has written a couple of books about infrastructure projects that go wrong. You've heard me on the radio and in the newspapers talking about the Murray-Darling in the last few days. Another typical very costly failure of big picture environmental management programs. The other thing we're starting to see is the retractions and so on of scientific papers. Look in Nature, look at the numbers of corrigenda and retractions that are going on in the major scientific journals. In other words, a lot of our science is not repeatable. Ioannidis and his group work particularly in medicine. It's a bit of a worry when somebody brings out a treatment which is supposed to work for a disease and then they apply it and it doesn't work at all. That's quite common now. Now, what does Foucaultian discourse analysis, what it means is that you sit and you listen to what people are saying, but you look behind what they're saying at where they're coming from, what the context is, and where the power sits in relation to where they are and what's being said. So it's really to get you to think outside the bubble that you're sitting in. And if you don't do that, you exist in the bubble and you think everything is fine. And in fact, the Anglo worldview is not shared by the rest of the world, and the history of the Anglo view, as I told you, really goes back to the 1980s. So we live in a world which has a particular worldview which is starting to run into trouble. Uncertainty is increasing. Now, where's the uncertainty coming from? Part of it is to do with the planet and climate. There is a world without us. There is a world in itself. There is a planet out there which we do not control. We think we do, but there is a planetary dynamics which impacts what we do, and I'll show you that in a minute. So in relation to energy, food, water, Cape Town is running out of water because of climate change, partly. Part of that is decreasing rainfall. Part of it is to do with our internal dynamics, the existential risks, the risks to existence from the way we organise our affairs, from politics, from economics, from legal frameworks. So, there's risks of nuclear warfare thanks to North Trump. We have issues with Brexit in Britain voting to leave the European Union. There are technological and innovation risks which are now rising. There are people who insist, like Nick Bostrom, that artificial intelligence is a major existential risk to us as humans. And we have legal, financial issues with public-private partnerships. And these are what's called the constitutive rules. This is like a soccer game. Who's in, who's on the pitch, what are the rules, how do you play the game? So we have uncertainty and complex risks that come from external things at the planetary level, but we also have existential and internal risks which arise from the way we organise our affairs. Now, if we just think that what we're doing is the only way to do it, then we kind of run into trouble. So there is a world in itself, but it runs on different rules to the normal, massive, sort of consistent Western world view of how to organise our affairs. Just to remind you, you think Cape Town's running out of water. This is Perth. I couldn't find the inflows to Cape Town's dams. I can't find the plot. But Perth is in the same latitude, and this is what's happened since 1911. We had a period of high variability, but lots of cold fronts crossing the southwest of Australia, lots of storage to even out the humps and bumps, but a rainfall supply which averaged about 338 gigalitres a year. And then rainfall in Perth started to decline. We ended up over there, so we've actually ended up with 42 gigalitres a year, which is 1/10 of what it used to be. That is climate change. That is what the models predict. I've had a look at the models' predictions for Cape Town, and they're the same. So part of the risk is climate change. Part of the risk is how do we manage and build our infrastructure? Have we got enough storage? Do we know how to ship water around? And part of it is that constitutive rules, who's in and who plays the game, how much water do we use as individuals? How do you get people to use less? What methods and persuasion can you use? Now, Perth has managed the situation very well. They've got more storage, they've got better infrastructure, and they've got the social infrastructure in place. Cape Town hasn't, so Cape Town's actually on a similar trajectory. So when it comes to uncertainty, some of it is, if you like, external and planetary, and so a lot of it is internal. And indeed, I would go so far as to say I'm less worried about climate change. I'm much more worried about the risks that arise from the way we manage our affairs. In other words, what did somebody say about nuclear war in Korea? It's one tweet away from disaster. I mean, it's literally a bit like that. So, science, to repeat, assumes that everything is low risk, that there's a technological fix, that we can manage it through scientific management, that largely isolated from environment and people. Level 2 risks are manageable systemic risks, like you're running a Sydney railway. Half the trains don't run on a Friday night, but it is manageable. We kind of understand, and we can try and get the drivers to come and do the right thing. It's the level 3 risks that we're worried about. The level 3 risks are complex, uncertain. They're these unpredictable, what have been called black swan events. They're recursive, they're complex, and they're all about life, people, society, and economics, and so on. Those are the risks that we really should be worrying about. And what science does is it uses tools from there and applies them from there and gets it wrong. So part of the risks that we face, part of the uncertainty comes from this. We drive rational calculation, i.e. predictive computer models, to optimal solutions. Optimal solutions which are at least cost and highest profitability, value capture, but they are not robust. Everything is now interconnected with everything else. They're fragile. This is low resilience. We're seeing that. Now, the point I want to make now is that when you interconnect all our infrastructure systems, which are built on the basis of the lowest bidder, and somebody, when I used to run the space business in CSIRO, somebody used to say to me, would you like to be put into orbit by the lowest bidder? But traditionally, when we build infrastructure, it's built by the lowest bidder. That's one set of risks, but when you interact that with the living world, you add a whole load of extra uncertainty, and that we underestimate. So these, what you might call soft systems, the living world, adds another level of risk. So the first thing that science does when dealing with these extra risks in that kind of middle ground now is it says, we'll use big data. We'll just collect a huge amount of data, and in there will be some magical truth. Well, just let me show you. This is about 17 years of half-hourly data, a lot of data, from a river in Wales. And what it shows is a power spectrum, so this is frequency against variability. And what it shows is that as you go to longer and longer time scales, you really get more and more and more variability. If you get a plot like this, which has a slope like that, there is no definable mean or standard deviation in the data. But what it actually means is if you send a student out to do some monitoring for 3 years, get a PhD, they get a trend, lovely, they publish it. Then you send a student out 2 years later and repeat it, and the trend's going the other way. Oops. So the problems with big data relate to the fact that we've got interconnected systems and life is involved as well. So the uncertainty is high, there is low statistical power, so evidence is hard to come by. More data gives you more questions. If it's, as we say, 1 over f, power more distributed, that plot I just showed you, there is no mean or standard deviation. And cause and effect are buried in complex network structures. And your predict act frameworks, that rational Western modeling prediction activity that we do all the time, fails. That's why we spent 63 billion euros on the rivers in the European Union and didn't get anything to show for it. Partly, we would have predicted that we wouldn't have got much to show for it, but worse, the monitoring, which would have shown, wasn't done either. So all sorts of now problems with retractions and corrigenda and so on in public papers. There are no magic bullets in this world when we connect ourselves to the planet in this way. I've just lost a wife to dementia. Very interesting. Your brain is probably the most complex entity on the planet. Everybody's brain is different. The main drugs that we have for dementia, 1/3 of people, they have no effect at all. This is the prime treatment for dementia. Best we can do is that 1/3 of people has no effect at all. 1/3 of people has some effect, and the other 1/3 you don't know. Right? And that's the best drug we've got. So that's the kind of thing that we get into when we try to manage complex biological living system. Maybe a third of the time something will happen, the rest of the time it doesn't. So let's now look at what goes on in here. This is the world of us, the human world, the world of life, the human world that has all sorts of nasty things in it, like emotions. People are irrational. We are limited beings. We're not reasonable all the time. We may try to be, but we're not. And that influences the way this whole thing works. So, when you put the observer in the loop, what you put into the loop is the reflexive presence of an engaged mind. And what do I mean by that? I mean someone who shows emotions, behavior, and responds. It's like driving down the freeway. You're trying to dodge between other people who are trying to dodge between you. You know, you close a road because you've got roadwork, so all the drivers immediately head off down other roads to try and get around the traffic count. Very hard to predict this kind of stuff. Now, there are some new developments in artificial intelligence. I refer you to a book by Andy Clark called Surfing Uncertainty. We can begin to understand the world of the human brain by thinking of it in terms of not a predictive computer model, but more like a neural network which uses heuristics and some kind of Bayesian priors to kind of figure out the way the world works. So we're not optimal, we're not efficient, but we're kind of effective, but we're limited and we're partially, if you like, reasonable. And the thing about Freud is nice, because he said we are not masters in our own house. The brain is a strange thing. It doesn't act in an optimal and predictable way. And Freud made the point that Copernicus pointed out that the planet is not the centre of the universe. Darwin pointed out that we are just social apes. So there's nothing special about the human being. And then Freud pointed out that even from the point of view of the brain, we are not masters in our own house. So we are but limited beings. Okay, so first source of uncertainty is complex risks arising from systems interactions. The second source of uncertainty is that we are what is called embodied. The brain is not some kind of separate reason machine, separate from the world, making decisions in a perfect way. The brain is actually embedded in the body. It's not separate from, so we are, as they say, embodied. The brain is connected to the rest of us. We are inactive, we do things. The brain responds, controls what we do. We are embedded in a social world, even more so now with social media and everything else. And we are extended now because we have all these extra bits of infrastructure, like satellites even, which allow us to collect data. And the brain and the world and us work by what is called unsupervised learning. It merely reinforces what works and trashes what doesn't. That's a very different strategy from scientific management. It's brutal, but it's effective, it's persistent. So, third person value-free rationalism, which is what science is replaced by phenomenology, which is about us. It's about emotions, it's about appearances, it's about expression. So the observer, now in the loop, is alive, aware, and emotional, and often does irrational things. And phenomenology, while science is about explanation, phenomenology is about meaning. So when we build a big chunk of infrastructure, we can explain how it's going to work, but the people on the other end of it will want to know what it means to them. And Pascal made the point with the Internet of Things here in this room a couple of weeks ago. Where are the people? Well, the people are emotional, alive, aware, reflexive, responsive, and often ornery. And you can't solve the problem by having a scientist, white, middle-aged male, standing here in a white coat, telling people what to do. That doesn't work anymore. So, life, third version of uncertainty, is what's called distributed robustness. Life is what's called equifinal. It does not have one set of initial conditions, one model, one outcome. Life has lots of different ways of doing things. So we've discovered, for example, that it's not one gene, one disease, one drug, as in dementia. So we have real problems now with medicine and pharmacology and trying to treat diseases, because a lot of them are extremely complex. So what life does is it tries various options, it trashes what doesn't work and moves on. That's what evolution is about. So life is robust. It has very good ways of quickly finding alternative ways of doing things. It's not efficient, it's not optimal, it's not predictable, and it's brutal. Because the trick is trash the failures, find a different way to do something, move on. And I just remind you that we are merely social apes, and in the evolutionary sense, the planet will be brutal to us in the end. 10 million years' time, which is a blink of an eye on this planet, there will be no recognizable human descendant left on this planet. That's what evolution's about. 10 million years isn't long on the planet, amazing long time to us. So, life's trick for managing risk is the other way up. The ball sits in a basin, it's allowed to wander about at random within the basin, doesn't matter where it is, it will stay somewhere within that sphere of attraction. You can't ensure this. It provides long-term security, it's self-organizing, it's only amenable to indirect management, and it actually exploits uncertainty. It doesn't try and reduce it, it actually exploits it, because that's how evolution works. So, if living organisms are involved, you cannot manage this by scientific management. Life has a qualitatively different modus operandi from economics and scientific management, and it's to do with reflexivity, the response of the organism, embodiment, and evolution. So we get these massive failures, so this is where the failures come from. So we're beyond this sort of modernist systems engineering. That's going to be an abstraction, a theoretical entity which doesn't usually work in these situations. And we're beyond what's called constructivist sociology. We're into a realm of a much more social kind of science, but it's different from what is normally understood to be that. A sort of social kind of science is usually to say, oh well, we just explain to people better what we're trying to do and everything will be fine. It doesn't work that way. So what are the consequences? And I told Tanya I was thinking of her as I got through towards the end of this talk, thinking she's going to know what's all this mean? You know, okay, that's fine. But so the consequences is that when we deal with these interrelated life and everything else, there is no universal predictive map or model. There are global constraints. There is a world without us, which has been here for 3 million years and will be here for a good time longer. But there is local and regional differences, but I'm not gone totally postmodern. There is a real world out there which we are constrained by. So there's context and contingency, but the third partly disordered, it's interactive. The thing is, no laws entail. There are no laws for life other than try if it works, trash it if it doesn't. So building computer models of living systems is a pretty hairy thing to try and do. So what can we do? Well, we can turn to phenomenology, which is a branch of philosophy which was invented, if you like, or developed by Merleau-Ponty. And we can think about something other than science in its universal laws, where we think about finality, efficiency, and optimality all the time. Phenomenology is about natural history, really. I mean, that's natural philosophy, which is senior sciences and predictive physics. Phenomenology takes you into a realm of much more of a sort of descriptive natural history. It's about expression, perceptions, feelings, appearances, local contextuality and place. And the thing is, somehow we've got to do both. We've tended to do all of that and impose it on that. But if we're going to be persistent on this planet, we have to think about somehow doing both at the same time. I've just written a blog about reasons and reasoning. Reason then is not some kind of God-given, isolated, theoretical faculty of humans, this magic universal acid, but it's something that we all do. Reasoning is a social activity. So it's about decisions, it's about justifications, it's about arguments, about social interaction. And reason is biased and flawed and partial and unreliable. And evidence is hard to come by. So the uncertainty comes from the nature of life and the systems on the planet that we deal with. One of the things that we have to do, what we do about it, is we have to be more reasonable, but in a different kind of way. We don't predict, we don't impose order and reason. We've got to try and cope with it as best we can. And this takes us to what's called complementarity. An idea that was first raised by Robert Oppenheimer. And this, I mean, a lot of these ideas are 50, 60 years old. There's very little new in what I'm saying. In 1953, in the Reith Lectures, Robert Oppenheimer raised this issue that you can have different ideas, different definitions of the same phenomenon depending on where you're coming from. This is horrendous anathema to science. You're not supposed to say this. Interestingly, in the last few months and maybe a year or two, we've started to think about what's called perspectival realism. Realism, our view of the world, depends where you're coming from. So the challenge for society is to take the different views, decide how to act, and then actually do something. Have you noticed that Western governments tend to be in a right mess at the moment? They don't seem to be able to govern. And the reason is that we elect politicians who decide on policies and then just drop them on us from Canberra, right? And everybody says, no, I didn't want to do that. We've got to really think about what the Lippmann said. Democracy is not about getting everybody to think the same, it's about getting people who think differently to act the same. And that goes back to about 1950-something as well, that quote. So the challenge then is to rethink democracy, to deal with the uncertainty that the world in which we live generates all by itself, and some of it's ours as well. And that means that there's ethics involved in this, because it raises the question that Gary Babbage kept asking, how we live. But we don't only live as a bunch of neoliberal economic, optimizing, super efficient people who want to make investments at low risk all the time. There's too much focus on people's interests, money, greed, profit, efficiency, effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and so on. There are other interests, taste, style, aesthetics, and even beauty, a word that you never hear used these days. Money is not the only value, but it is as far as the world we live in. So what we've got to start thinking about are the constitutive rules. Remember the soccer game. Who's in, who plays the game, who's on the pitch, what are the rules, who's the referee, and what's the measure of winning, i.e. do we have to score goals? The other problem with all this is that with social media, there are massive changes afoot in this area now, which we are totally not managing. Innovation is running way ahead of ethics or any other consideration, and far from being a democratic influence. Uber, Amazon, eBay, your IoT is going the same way, Pascal, Google, and everything else. They're all privately owned. There are a small number of people making a huge amount of money out of you and I. So social media are about surveillance. You like chatting to your friends on social media, but it's not about that. What social media is really about is collecting data on you and then selling it back to you. I'm not on any social media yet, apart from LinkedIn, and I keep thinking I should get off that too. So there are enormous changes afoot in terms of disintermediation, getting rid of levels of organisation, and all sorts of issues about the web and so on. And as I wrote in my recent blog on the power of science, we've developed this thing called the Optical, which sees everything. Social media now know exactly where we are, what we're doing, who we're talking to, what ads we're looking at, and so on. Is that what we want science for? So we must remind ourselves that we are limited beings. We are not rational animals. We have emotional needs. We can be devious and untruthful. Barnaby Joyce, please know.
Oh, that was me. You're on record.
Right? I mean, just look at what goes on in the world, right? We have bubbles and we have bitcoins. Pump and dump is this trick of buying a bunch of shares, talking it up so the price goes up, and then selling them again as quickly as you can so you make money. It's illegal actually, but it's widely done. Innovation Ponzi schemes. Most of what we do in what's called innovation and business development is a Ponzi scheme. You have an idea, you put it in a package, you sell it to somebody, they look at the package and quickly sell it on to somebody else at a profit. Some poor blighter in the end ends up holding the package. Very few of them actually ever generate any revenue. Public and private partnerships used to be the flavour of the month, but if you talk to Brian Collins in London, he will tell you that within 5 years we knew that public and private partnerships were not the way to go, but we're all locked in for 25 or 30 years on the contract. So we're stuck with these turkeys that are giving us problems. You might have seen in the news this massive UK company called Carillion just went bankrupt. It was also a Ponzi scheme. The only problem was that they privatised the whole chunk of defence. So their major defence contractor that was looking after things like nuclear submarines just went bust. Oops. Smart meters. You know, what do? We have this new electricity grid. We want people to be more efficient, so we give them a smart meter that sits in the kitchen. And the idea is that you can look at how much electricity you're using and you'll be more efficient, won't you? Well, the last time I looked when I was in Lancaster, we gave everybody smart meters. What did they do? All the teenagers decided to turn everything on in the house to see how big a number they could get on the smart meter, right? Which kind of defeated the whole object of the exercise. So the world is not stationary. Trends of rainfall and so on. It's not optimal. It's not efficient or fully rational. And I always put this in at this point. If you want an ideal situation which is not fully rational, just go to Venice. Nobody in their right modern mind would have ever built that thing. But it's beautiful. It is one of the icons of the planet, right? And that wasn't built on the basis of cost effectiveness or profit or anything else. It was built by a bunch of very greedy and rapacious people who ripped off most of the Mediterranean, but they built some gorgeous things. And San Marco has been there for more than 1,000 years. So we are limited beings. We must deal with the uncertainty of the world in other ways. So what does all this mean? So how does this change what we do and how we do it? So the first thing is we've got to expect the unexpected. The tails of those non-normally distributed statistical properties that I referred to earlier. And we need to design our democracy, our institutions and the constitutive rules to be flexible and resilient. In other words, we must expect, if we're getting down, that we might run out of water one of these years, but what are we going to do when it happens? And don't worry about it like, oh my God, it's going to happen next month. Try and think through what you need to do to be more robust and persistent. So we need flexibility. One thing we do not have with our governance systems at the moment is flexibility. Less tell, more engage, more discourse and reasoning. Even though people are going to be unreasonable, you still have to do it. And there are other values, beauty and so on, that we need to worry about, and ethics also. So we've got to do the representation and the phenomenological expression. We've got to do the explanation and the meaning. Now, in closing, how do you want your rivers to look? Do you want them to look like that? or do you want them to look like the channel, the concrete channel in Los Angeles that I showed you initially? Which would you prefer? Yeah, people prefer this because that has values which are not scientific, not money, not rationality, not efficiency, not optimality. That's a mess, but it's a rather gorgeous and beautiful mess. And in fact, it's only about 12, 15 kilometers from here, if you know where to look. Bottom of Macquarie Pass. As you go up Macquarie Pass, just on the right at the bottom, there's a car park. Walk into the waterfall at the back. You'll go past that. Quite close to here. Now, we could not have any better examples than this country at the moment. We are ruled by rampant neoliberal rationalism, jobs and growth, which is all we hear about. Right? The environment is paying the price. I was just involved with the Murray-Darling, and it's a conflict between rationalist economics, putting a value on the environment, ecosystem services, agriculture, environment, lovely links to energy as well. So here's links between water infrastructure and electrical infrastructure. Energy at the moment, coal versus renewables. Have you noticed a certain lack of governance these days? Have you noticed a certain problem in Canberra that they go kind of get it? And in fact, the way they're trying to promulgate policy and the way they're actually trying to organise and run the country is running into all kinds of problems. Why do you think in Britain the Labour Party, elected Jeremy Corbyn? Why do you think in Britain all sorts of people voted for Brexit? Why do you think a lot of people voted for Trump? It is a reaction against a particular kind of worldview, and we're starting to see the meta-architecture, as it's called, the constitutive rules, the way we do governance is critical, and we've got a magnificent series of examples in this country of a kind of one-eyed approach to policy which doesn't take the uncertainties into account. So, that's what's happened to the river. So, what do you want? That? Or that? That's the bottom of the Murray. That's the remains of the black box forest that were on the floodplain. It's gone totally salted. That, for geological history, is now gone. That's what happens when you get the constitutive rules wrong. That's what happens when you get the risk assessments wrong. That's what happens when you essentially ignore the fact that there is a planet out there which runs on a different series of rules. So we must think about increasing resilience in the face of uncertainty. As Ricardo will tell you, firstly, having a diversity of views is critical. We are facing a whole series of uncertain interactions and risks that we are unable to manage by the usual scientific management. The only way to tackle this, unfortunately, is through a kind of messy form of democracy, and that means getting people around a table and trying to figure out what the best way forward is. It may not be perfect, so we need some flexibility, adaptability, and above all, some nimbleness. We need to be able to accept the fact that that didn't work, and we try something different. And this goes back to Foucault again. This goes back to thinking about the discourse that we're having, thinking about where people are coming from, who's in and how we play the game, and in terms of shared meaning. This takes time to achieve. I've run some major projects in my life involving people, different kinds of scientists who have different worldviews. And it takes a year to 18 months to even get people to talk the same language and understand what other people around the table are saying. It takes time. So we're running up against our own constraints. We are limited beings. We bring beliefs, pre-constrained views, all sorts of things to the table. So we're thinking now about what you might call post-modernist systems. the existential risks that we face, be they external planetary, even asteroids, you know, if you want to go cosmic, the existential risks, some of them come from the world in itself, the planet, the realist world out there. Some of it comes from the way we do our own business. Those existential risks will force us to change. The question is, do we do it, or do we have it done to us? Because life says, try that, work, trash it, move on. So if the way we're governing ourselves on this planet doesn't work, we'll just get trashed. That's a pretty brutal thing to say, but that's the way life works. And if you look to the geography and history of conflict on the planet, you'll see that historically that's what happened. Are we going to have a war between the US and China? Maybe that's one only way to solve that particular worldview conflict. So how do we change the modernist mindset? How do we find new ways, a middle ground, something totally different? There is a lovely book called A History of Half-Forgotten Kingdoms. It's about the history of Central and Western Europe and the fact that all sorts of littered across it are societies that tried a governance model, didn't quite make it, just passed into history. Might be the odd castle left somewhere that was some king's domain originally a few hundred years ago, but the world is full of half-forgotten kingdoms. So, in conclusion, so if modernism is insufficient for complex hard and soft systems, then what is? What kind of democracy, institutions and constitutive groups do we need? This becomes a highly political question, and so it should be. We're frozen at the moment in a worldview in the West, and that's in sort of US, Canada, UK, Australia primarily, the sort of Anglo world, is frozen in a particular kind of neoliberal, financial, modern, you know, predictive, scientific management, evidence-based approach to the world. Amazingly, there is an alternative. When you look at the literature, and it's in the political science literature, it's called reflexive modernism. What it does is it takes the views of the community into account. It was first thought up in 1921. The definitive book on this was written in 1985. The best book on the scientific and financial approach to environmental management, i.e. ecosystem services, market-based instruments and all those sorts of things, the best book on that was written by Martin Heyer in Holland in 1994. So the alternatives have been in the literature for 25 or even 50 years. We are starting to see, I think, a change, and that people are starting to get peed off with what's going on. But when it comes to uncertainty, it is greater than we expect. When you put the observer in the loop, you get a different kind of uncertainty. When you put the observer in the loop, you then have to take that observer's views, however partial, bent, and irrational they happen to be, you have to take those views into account. We're not good at doing that. There are other ways to think about the problem. I rest my case. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think this presentation should become a compulsory course lecture to every student in this university in the first year. Questions, comments?
I can just answer that comment. When I talk to a couple of my young mates in the philosophy department, what they do when they teach philosophy is they sit the students down and they say, has it occurred to you that there is another way of thinking about the world that you're in? And it takes a while, apparently, to get people to do that Foucaultian analysis, actually get outside their bubble and then look at it from the outside. So there are people who are trying to do just that.
Yeah, but that's the point, that if we all need 20, 30 years of career and existence to realize that, the rules of biology.
That's right.
We're on the slopey slope here.
That's right. We are but social apes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jason.
This question's partially formed, so it might be just a discussion prompt.
That's all right.
Yeah. I think the way you're framing the world is it's something like a forest. Lots of different stuff grows in there, and for one successful tree, you have thousands and thousands of attempts that die, thousands of false starts.
Yeah, that's right.
We're trying to run the world like a hydroponics lab, where we optimise the conditions. We take a single seedling and we want to develop it all the way through to maturity. One birth, one life cycle, one death, optimised the whole way through.
Yeah.
In terms of political systems that would allow us to manage our place in the world more like a forest, I don't have the answer, but if we're going to move towards a more anarchistic and organic sort of system, the last one of these I came to, I sort of asked the question at the end, and I was like, oh, the economy is the problem. But it's the same thing here, I think, in that all of our economies revolve around money as a liquid expression of resource. There's other values out there. There's other economies in the world. I spent some time in Vanity last year, and they're trying to get an alternative economic model off the ground, which is little to do with money.
That's right.
It's more to do with meeting people's contemplative needs.
Yeah.
When I was looking at the way you were talking about alternative ways to structure the way we engage with the world, alternative values that we can engage, I was wondering if you'd given thought to the value of love, altruism, which is one of those big...
Absolutely.
Yes, so if we're going to allow a decomposition of sort of top-down hierarchical government structures and allow life to happen a little bit more naturally, that sort of thing can work, but you need a powerful antidote to selfishness so that the individual isn't taking advantage of the absence of rules to trample the weak individuals around them. And I was just wondering if you've given any thought to a political structure where we can treat love and respect for each other as a capital item that has value like money.
I mean, I fully agree with you. I wish it was possible. I guess in 3 o'clock in the morning, I take the kind of brutal ecological view. If you look back in history and you think of the planet with all its nations, all its societies, as a series of experiments as to how best to get by in the world. If you look at history, there has always been conflict. There have always been winners and losers. And I think if you take that kind of view, then little experiments, which, you might think Cuba is another kind of an experiment, which is less developed, but puts a lot more emphasis into education and medical care, for example. I mean, they all drive crappy old cars, but, so what? If you think about the planet as a kind of distributedly robust series of experiments in how to best get by, then you've got to stop thinking in terms of the Murdoch press, right? And the people that yell about neoliberalism all the time, and you've got to start thinking about how we might adopt ideas from other places. The thing that really struck me was on LinkedIn, I've got a sort of a colleague, if you like, called Umberto Mariotti in Brazil, who was the first one who pointed out to me that there is a huge literature about complexity, about ethics, about other ways of viewing the world, but it's not in English. It's in Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and French. It's in the Romance languages, right? So, we sit in our bubble in the West, thinking that the way we do things is the only way to do things. It's not. There are totally different worldviews represented by other nations, and all I'm saying is that if you apply the kind of evolutionary model to this, then if the West doesn't get it right, then we'll be one of those half-forgotten kingdoms in another few hundred years. Just take that longer-term view. So if somebody out there is trying a different experiment in how to get by, one of these days it might take over, which would be, I'd like to be around to see it, but I won't be.
Who knows?
No, of course. No.
Let me just piggyback on this one. The fact that these Mediterranean languages-based countries, because that's a language, Latin-based one. No, actually, these are in many cases countries where up until recently philosophy was still taught at school, given these countries generations, not only of scientists, but decision makers, with this kind of soft approach and more complex views on the world than probably more liberal Anglo-Saxon westernized views, simplistic views of the world have given the US and UK. So I think, and unfortunately in France, I think we're running away from it because we're becoming more modernist, westernized.
Yeah.
But I think that's a big mistake. The best thing I've ever had in my life was to learn about French philosophers when I was still struggling with my math and physics.
Yeah, I mean, for example, go to Italy, where they still have co-ops. You know, you go, if you want to go to the shops to buy something, you go to the local co-op. So a lot of their societies are organised locally and regionally around cooperatives and so on. I mean, they produce most of the world's high value-added quality design. I mean, I'm wearing an Italian suit made from Australian wool. Pretty crazy if you think about it, isn't it? But so, you know, other nations have different sets of values to the ones that we particularly have. And I think it's really important as you sit in Australia to do that kind of critique of what environment am I sitting in? Is there another way of doing things? Yeah.
John, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this presentation. I just wanted, it's like a comment, and to say that you said that maybe modernism is insufficient, but maybe modernism is the problem. Like, as you said, nowadays the teaching, the education, as we call it, education industry, the science, everything is becoming an industry in the modern world. Like maybe 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, scientists usually think about the problems, the real needs of people, and try to find an answer, a solution for that. But nowadays, science is like producing the proof of what, at bigger level, governments or policymakers are happy to listen, are looking for.
Yeah.
So that is the biggest bias that I think we have in science in general now, and in economics as well. If you look at the history of, basically the economics is defined as allocating the limited resources to unlimited desires and needs. So we don't have the word money or kind of monetary term
economics is
anywhere
about
in
choice.
economics.
Yeah.
But nowadays it's not like that. And if you look at the 200 years ago, the economics that we have, most literature that we have for in 1800s written, is based on the human behavior and human choices. But in the last century, when you look at the biggest economists like Keynes that we had, they were like macroeconomists who were just trying to find, the best way to give to the governments to get out of the crisis that they had. So I think that kind of modernism, that kind of trying to push people to think in the way that they do, like as you said nowadays, even it becomes worse because nowadays we hear that just to say that we have to keep our children away from the pressure and exam pressure. They say that, for example, why a person who might be a mathematic, for example, in future needs to know about philosophy. Why those who are going to be doctors need to know about, say, art. So they're trying to just make our view, they're trying to decrease the diversity of views and opinions, and that will make bigger mistakes.
Sure, but that's a very Western thing. I mean, I remember talking to Ricardo when he came back from Brazil. You said you talked to the people in the universities in Brazil, and they were only just starting to think about raising some money. No? I mean, universities in other countries, France is different too, I think, in that you've got CNRS and you've got universities. So,
might change.
Yeah, there are other ways of thinking.
Even in Eastern countries, it's changing as well. Like they're just following one trend, which is in the world.
I agree.
Any other comment, question?
So we have talked a lot about this. I will just throw one, which is about time. Okay? We know that nature and life works on these diverse ways. Some die, some leave, and so on. And this takes time. Right? For the real sort of problems we have, whether it's a war, whether it's a business or there's a project, there is a time. Okay? So to solve these with this sort of a life-like approach will take time, which politically or then economically is not feasible, right? So how to address it? I know it's a huge question.
Short-term and long-term decision. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So go to war and try something. Maybe 10,000 people will die, but that's okay. Next time we'll do it right. You know.
Believe it or not, there is a book written by Ian Wilson which is called War. What is it good for? Right? And he came to a very surprising conclusion. He said to him, you know, he said this publicly, having written this great big, huge great thing, sort of deep history book. He said surprising to him was the fact that the result of warfare was that most times something better came out of it afterwards. Right? And there are times when the only way to stop doing what has become maladaptive, you might say, is to turn over the whole darn thing.
Yeah, the limit theory of war and
That's right, the kind of evolutionary approach.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to come to a close. Please join me again to thank Graham for a very inspiring